What's up, everybody? Wanted to come on and make a video. It's probably the first coaching content that I've done in a very long time, so hopefully start doing some more of that. But what I wanted to talk about today, it is about that time of year. Inevitably, last shows of the season. For most people, I know the Tennessee shows end in a couple of weeks. We got Night of Champions in November, and that's it for the season for Tennessee. So inevitably, everybody is going to start considering hiring a new coach. Maybe you aren't, prepping right now and you're thinking about hiring a new coach for whatever reason, or, you're going to see it through with the current coach you have and then, see how it goes on stage, how you place, how you feel about things, etc. So I just want to bring up some things to consider as far as that goes. If things don't go exactly the way you want them to on stage, or your placings aren't exactly what you want them to be, that doesn't necessarily mean you need a new coach. All right, so some of the things that you should ask yourself in reflection on how the process has gone, first and foremost, does your coach seem knowledgeable? Are they making changes that make sense? Are they able to explain changes if you ask them? Do they have results that they can prove, with other clients, or some sort of education that they've had, or whatever that may look like. So, you can figure that out. That's pretty easy to see if the coach is knowledgeable or not. You may not know exactly what everything is or should be or whatever, but if they seem like they know what they're talking about, that's a decent place to start. There are a lot of people that act like they know what they're talking about, or use big words to make their clients feel stupid and not ask further questions and things like that. But there's really no way to decipher that until you do. But ultimately, is your coach knowledgeable, or do they just seem like they're doing random, nonsense, each check-in or whatever? So start there. Is your coach knowledgeable? Do they seem to know what they're talking about? All right, that's a great place to start. And then it goes from there. Not only do you need the knowledge, but you also need to be able to manage people. So, is your coach responsive? When you send your check-ins, are they getting it back to you, getting the answers back to you in a timely manner? Don't expect a, 30-minute turnaround time on check-ins. Sometimes that's the case, if somebody's, deep in prep and I move my clients to WhatsApp. So a lot of times my competitors get the first response, and it can be pretty quick, especially if I know I need to make some changes, pretty quickly. But, are your coaches responding, or is your coach responding in a reasonable amount of time? It's obviously really important, because if you need to make changes, or if you need to know something, or if you have a question, or, whatever, clarification, it's important that the coach gets back to you. Now, don't be unreasonable with this, but there are some, some pretty, the expectations that you have, you need to make sure that they're meeting those if they're reasonable expectations. So, is your coach responsive? Is your coach knowledgeable? Does your coach seem happy to work with you? That's definitely important. You want somebody that's excited about what you're doing and excited to get you the results, and you want to feel good about what you're doing and who you're working with, and that sort of thing. So if you're not having a good experience with a coach, if you don't feel like it's something that you can bring up and maybe work through with that coach, then it may be time to move on. That's just from the coaching standpoint. All right. Don't go asking other coaches, hey, what would you have done here, or what do you think, or whatever, because then you're just going to get confused. Maybe if you're shopping around, and that's definitely a time to start, picking the brains of potential coaches, but don't go in the middle of your last couple of weeks of prep, or in your peak week or whatever, and second guess what your coach is doing, or ask for feedback or insight from other coaches. That's just not going to lead down a good road, and just isn't a good thing. But once you've finished your show and the dust has settled, it might be time to get some insight from some outside sources. But don't do it while you're in prep and while you're in peak week and things like that, because your mind's not right anyway. So the process, how did you feel about it? Did you like just the way that coach did things? And if it's something that, if you like the coach and you want to stick with them, address that with that coach. Don't go running to another coach to try to switch things if if things weren't, there was nothing wrong to begin with. it may be just that you need to address things with your coach, and communication's huge there. So, reach out to the coach that you have, let them know some things you might like differently and that sort of thing. And if they're a good coach and a good business person, then they'll be, receptive to that. So again, were they knowledgeable? Were they responsive? Did you enjoy the process with that coach? All right. And then, as you realistically evaluate your placings and your look, did the coach miss terribly, right? Like if you were nowhere near in shape, or if you tried some crazy peak week strategy that didn't work, that's something you should evaluate, because that's probably going to happen again if a coach has a certain way they do things, and it could be hit or miss and things like that. So, how did the result turn out, right? Like, you can't go into a first show as a natural competitor and expect that you're going to walk away with an overall, typically, right? So have some realistic expectations of where your placings and what your look should be, where you started, how much progress you made, who else showed up at the show, right? Like, depends on what type of show you're doing. If you're doing a bigger show, then it's, you may not place that great if it's your first time, or if you need more muscle tissue, or whatever the case may be. So definitely evaluate what the actual end result was realistically, right? So if things should have been better or different, then it may be time to hire a new coach. But again, be realistic about that. Don't hire a coach expecting, even if it's a coach who has some high level athletes, right? If you want to look like, ABC client that they have that does really well, look at that client and either look at their genetics. If they're, superior to yours, then that may be a problem that's going to take a little bit more time to make up for on your end, or you may never get there if it's somebody that's shaped differently than you, or it just has, better propensity to build muscle, or whatever the case is. So just evaluate your placings, and, be realistic about it. And if it wasn't what realistically should have been, then that may be a conversation to have, or you may need to, look elsewhere and move on. Now, I've talked about the coach, right? So what you should evaluate from the process and the results that you've had with the coach. But now, or maybe even first, ask yourself, did I follow the plan perfectly, right? Did I give the coach everything that they needed to make the right decisions? Did I fill in my app that they use, or my spreadsheet, or did I put in the emails all the information that they were asking for at check-ins? A coach can only make decisions based off the data that they have. So if you're not providing everything that they're asking for, they're basically working blindly, in a sense. There may be some things that are more important than others, of course, but that's it's on the client and the athlete to make sure that the coach has what they need to make the right decisions. There's no coach in the world that can just blindly lead somebody to a win or a great look, without some information, whether that's pictures on time, or good quality pictures, good check-in photos, check-ins on time, all that kind of stuff. So did you follow the plan, and did you get the information to the coach and get them what they needed? Did you communicate with the coach? If you were having trouble with something, or if you didn't like something, or if something didn't feel right or didn't feel good, or whatever. Obviously prep has its ups and downs with how you feel and things, but did you communicate with that coach? And if you didn't, you can't blame that coach. Okay, so it may be something that you need to evaluate within yourself, and after the show's over, or even now, if you've got a little bit time left in the prep, you can try to fix that as best you can. So that may be something to evaluate in yourself, and not look for another coach. So those are some things to think about as far as the coaches and yourself, and is this a good fit? Do I need to move on? But also, my biggest piece of advice is it's probably not the coach. It's probably either that you need more time, or there may have been something in your prep that you could have done better or differently. But it's definitely, you have to look at it holistically and make a decision based on all of the information, not just, well, I didn't win my show, so I'm hiring somebody else, right? Or whatever that might look like. So that's definitely, those are definitely some things to consider. What I will say is don't, like I said earlier, don't go looking for a new coach while you're with a coach. if you're in a prep and things are, you're getting close to a show and things like that, just because you don't feel great or somebody else comes in and says, hey, you don't need to be doing X, Y, and Z that this coach has you doing, that's not the time to switch. That's not the time to go shopping. It's not the time, right? You need to finish out what you're doing. As long as your health is not, at risk unreasonably. This sport is not the most healthy, but there are certain things that are non-negotiable as far as health. And so if your health is not in jeopardy, then, and you're able to actually finish the prep and whatever, then you should probably see that through and see how it turns out, and then evaluate after the show. So just want to say, it's that time of year where people start considering switching coaches or getting new coaches and things like that. So just think about those things. Look at everything, all the way around, from the coach's perspective, from your own perspective. Just evaluate all these things, and then if you need to switch coaches, then that's that may be your next step. I'm going to make a video tomorrow on what to look for in a new coach, if you do decide to make that switch, and I will be happy to answer any questions about this video or the next one in comments, or you can message me or whatever. If you're interested in coaching, in my coaching services, feel free to send me a DM. Email is also in my bio as well. I think my phone number is there too, so feel free to reach out however. But even if you don't want to hire me, if you have questions about the processes or anything like that, I'll be happy to answer. I love the sport, and I just want to see it continue to grow. So thanks if you stayed to the end of this, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow.